Welcome to Wizard Team, a Black magical podcast for Black magical stories. Hi, everyone. It's Bayana and Porshèa embarking on a journey through the many fantasy stories written by and about Black people. Today, we're really excited to be joined by Kalynn Bayron, author of Sleep Like Death. Hi, Kalynn.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for stopping by. We've had you before for different Black Nerds Create things, so it's so great to catch you again. It's been a couple years,
It's
so
been
this
a
is why it's
while.
great.
Yeah.
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 Oh gosh, yeah. And so I feel like one of the things that we've established early on is you loved Cinderella is Dead, and loved the idea that you're coming back to the universe with Sleep Like Death, and we could not wait to actually get to talk to you about like what all is happening here. So if you wouldn't mind, would you briefly tell the audience what Sleep Like Death is about?
Yeah, so Sleep Like Death is loosely connected to Cinderella is Dead. I think of it more as kind of like a like the extended universe of Cinderella is Dead. It takes place in a neighboring queendom, and this queendom is being plagued by this kind of a dark character known as the Knight. And my main character, Eve, is the daughter of the queen, and she's kind of the queen's right hand. She has the ability to conjure weapons from nature. So she has these very kind of unique abilities, and she is a fighter. She's been trained from the time that she was born to kind of ultimately, hopefully, have a confrontation with the Knight, who is very elusive. Um, and through this journey, we kind of see her uncover some really devastating things about her own family's history. And this is a tale that really asks you like Cinderella is Dead, to kind of scrutinize the tale that you think you know, and be open for it to be something else. And it also has that thread of horror, which I absolutely love, and kind of that shows up in my work again and again. So. Um, I was really excited to be able to take on another princess and kind of put a different kind of spin on Snow White, because this is a Snow White reimagining. It's a kind of remixing of that tale, um, in very much the same way that Cinderella is Dead was a different take on that story as well.
Yeah. So you already mentioned that like they're in the same kind of universe. Did you always know that, or at least hope that you would like have other stories within that universe, or like when did the idea for Sleep Like Death come to you?
Yeah, I knew I was going to write this story while I was writing Cinderella is Dead. So I wrote Cinderella is Dead in 2016. And I think by the time I got done with that first draft, I realized that I wanted this to be more than just this one story, but I didn't necessarily want to write a direct sequel. I wanted
Mhm.
to try to have something that was connected, but that if you pick them up kind of out of order, that it would still work. So Snow White was at the top of my list, kind of right under Cinderella, along with a lot of other kind of familiar fairy tales. So yeah, I always kind of wanted it to be this universe of stories, and the setting, the seeds for that were in place as far back as that first draft of Cinderella's Dead.
I love that about like their own kind of like universe kind of thing is happening here, but not necessarily like
Right.
full universe. And I really did like I took a moment to reread Cinderella's Dead right ahead of rereading Sleep Like Death. I noticed there's a line in Cinderella's Dead where there's a mention of a queen in their country being rumored to speak to a mirror, and then I couldn't help but think, oh, okay, so that's a direct tie-in into Sleep Like Death, even though it's like a throwaway line amongst all the other action that's taking place in the story. And similarly, in Sleep Like Death, there's a mention of a witch who's rumored to have raised the dead, which spoiler not spoiler for people who haven't read Cinderella's Dead, but there that is something that happens there, right?
Yeah.
So I assume that's a direct call back to Cinderella's Dead, but I did want to ask because I don't want to assume too much. Are these direct, like, are they supposed to be tie-ins to each other, or is there possibility that there might be more to come in this universe and we're just not seeing all the hints until possibly later?
Yeah, no, that is a direct, reference to Cinderella's Dead. I really wanted that in there for the readers and for myself because I think those types of things are fun. But there are in Sleep Like Death, there are, hints to at least 2 other stories that I would really like to write, within this universe. So we'll keep our fingers crossed to see if that happens. But there's also, in Cinderella's Dead, there are a few more kind of, I guess maybe Easter eggs to other stories that I'd like to include in this universe. So yeah, it's fun to kind of put those in there and know that they're in there for a reason. And a lot of people do. They read Cinderella's Dead, and that is kind of a throwaway line for them, but it's like it's there for a reason. And I
Mhm.
think it's fun to kind of come back to that and see there. See, I told you like all those years ago it was gonna happen eventually. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like that's one of the, like, fun things about creating things in shared universes is you can just, like, drop things and no one knows and except for you until they do know, and it's, like, this whole kinda discovery.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's,
fun.
like,
It's a
always
fun thing
fun.
to do. Yeah.
Mhm. So, retellings and, like, reimaginings obviously come with built-in elements prior, to, like, writing the story, but then also require a lot of thinking about, like, how to make the story and the characters feel new and different. So, how do you approach retellings? Like, when you first kinda start out, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I think for me it's really about the themes that are present in these stories. So the theme, if I can kind of identify that, you know, there's usually more than one, but a lot of these fairy tales that we're familiar with have these themes of, you know, villainous women and people kind of needing to be saved. And those are all things that make those older kind of versions of these fairy tales work. But I like to think that we live in an evolving world. You know, things are constantly changing, societal views are constantly changing. So I like to try to address those issues, but in a way that feels kind of timely. So I try to first approach looking at the theme of the story, and then because I know that my reimaginings are going to center Black characters and Black families and Black experiences, I think that in and of itself changes the dynamic of some of these stories because it's not just painting the roses red. It's really making sure that my characters reflect, you know, our nuance and our way of seeing the world in under these you know, even though it's a fairy tale, I think that those things are important. So I try to approach it in a couple different ways, but mostly I'm always looking for some place to really tell a scary story. I love horror, and even though these are fantasy stories, a lot of that is inspired by my love of scary stories. So I'm always looking for a way in that kind of has a more kind of gruesome horror element to it.
The more you speak of horror and fairy tale, the more you're just speaking up my alley, and I just
Yeah.
needed a moment to note that. Like, I'm like, "Yes, yes, this is why every time I pick up one of your books, I'm like, and of course I love it. This is exactly what I was looking for." So thank you. But also, um, I w another feature that I really enjoy about your writing and the way that you build stories, is that there's always, like, a suggestion, not only in that the fact of, like, we all know the mainline, um, fairy tales that are kind of being used to build the story, but there's kind of, like, this feeling, like, in reading the way that you build into the story for yourself, that perhaps what we've learned it wasn't actually us learning, it was just being we were fed a suggestion and we've just gone along with it. So I would like to know if how do you decide like which aspects of the original story that you base your retellings on warrant further exploration? Why do you like when you decide like, oh no, this is I'm gonna build that out to actually be like, we should have explored this a little bit more. We kind of left a Snow White and the crone kind of thing in this one place, but we probably should actually like interrogate that differently. When do you make that decision?
Yeah, I think it's something that happens really early on in the process. I think every retelling that I approach, I have in the back of my mind kind of Wicked by Gregory Maguire. So I loved Wizard of Oz when I was a kid. I absolutely love that movie. I'm a huge musicals fan, so I loved that movie. And then when I read Wicked, it took all of these very familiar elements. We have the Emerald City and we have the Yellow Brick Road. We have these characters, we have Dorothy, we have, the Cowardly Lion, which we don't find that out in that first book, but all of these very familiar characters. But we get to see how they got to be there, because when we watch The Wizard of Oz, there isn't really a lot of backstory about, and specifically talking about the movie, there's not a lot of backstory about how the Tin Man got to be how he is and how the lion got to be where he is. So we get a very, I think, shortened version of these characters' lives. But I'm always interested in what happened before and what happens after. What happens after the happy ending, and what happened before? How did these characters even get here? So I think in most of my reimaginings, I'm approaching it with that in mind. And I'm also always looking at side characters, because I feel like the Wicked Witch was there the whole time, and nobody really thought what was going on with her. Like, what was her deal? Like, she's just very angry that you dropped a house on her sister, and she wants her shoes back, and it's like, why? And so those are the questions that I'm asking when I approach, Snow White, and why do people act the way they do? What are their motivations? And so, so I'm always kind of approaching it with that in the back of my mind. Um, but I also want people to know that we are in a familiar space. I want people to know that we're still in another kind of version of this story. But so I will pepper in familiar characters, familiar settings, and they may not look exactly the same, but they're familiar. For example, in Sleep Like Death, we meet, a man named Claude Kingfisher, and he has 7 sons, and so it's kind of, we're like, oh, okay, here's 7 people. They're kind of living in the woods. This is a familiar thing, but there's more to it than that. How did they get there? Why are they there? What are their motivations? Why do they go along with having this strange girl in their house? Like, why is this happening? So that's kind of how I approach those things. I want to make people feel like it's familiar, but I also want to give them something new.
Going off of that a little, like both Cinderella is Dead and Sleep Like Death contain like mysteries or like hidden histories. Um and kind of look at the way that like myth can shape society. Um I guess why was that something that you wanted to interrogate, and like why did this feel like the right kind of vehicle for that?
Yeah, I think for me it is that I'm always wanting to question the narrative. I always feel like there's something uh that I'm not getting on the first read through of these fairy tales. It feels like I'm missing something, and I don't necessarily think that's always the case, but I get that feeling sometimes. And so, for me, it really is about kind of. I love a good hidden history. I love a good mystery. That I think that goes back to my own love of mystery novels. Nancy Drew mystery stories were some of the first books that I ever read cover to cover, just because that's what I had access to. And so those mystery elements are there. I think it helps drive the plot. So I think it's a good narrative device. But I also think there's the theme of kind of interrogating what you've been told, what you've been led to believe. That pops up again and again and again in most of my work, because I think that we have, in this year of, Beyonce 2024, there's a real kind of lack of critical thinking sometimes. And
Mhm.
it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to know that just because we've done something one way for a really long time doesn't mean we have to continue doing it that way. We can learn a new way of doing things, a new way of being. And so that theme pops up again and again and again for me, because I just feel like it's something that fairy tales specifically are a really good vehicle for, because we all know these stories, even if we haven't sat down to read them, or if we haven't seen the movie in forever. We kind of know Cinderella, we kind of know Snow White. But what if I told you the story that you thought you knew is completely different? Would that change the way you think about certain characters, or certain the actions of those characters? And that applies to real world situations as well. And so I think it's just a really good tool for reaching younger readers, and kind of saying, think critically, ask questions, get to the truth, because that is ultimately what matters most.
Yeah, and though you're building off of like these myths and like I don't know, some of them have entered their own kind of like history. Like they have so many different retellings and so many different ideas that have gone and built off of them, right? Um as you're building them for yourself and your own world building, how do you balance and like think through um and create that creation, and what is your favorite part of it, and what often do you find to be difficult when you're trying to build that out for yourself? And like I know again the canon of the history of all the retellings and things, how do you figure that all out?
Yeah, I keep since I wrote Cinderella is Dead, I keep kind of like it's a I have it here somewhere, but it's a notebook. Like it's and it's full of notes from Cinderella is Dead, from Sleep Like Death, where I feel like I've kind of built this interconnected world, and it can get a little complicated even for me, even though I made it. I'm still like, wait a minute, did I say that? Did that, so I keep all of these things kind of written down, and I add to it as I go with each new kind of story idea and other things that I'm hoping to write. I have them kind of in there on a timeline and how they interact with each other. And that is one of my most favorite parts of kind of the creative process, is putting all of that together, because even though none of that supplemental material will probably ever make it out of those notebooks. It gives me as a storyteller a good base for crafting these stories, where it doesn't. I hope, anyways, that it doesn't feel like it just came out of nowhere. It feels like there's some history and some weight to these stories, and that gives me a really good canvas for kind of building out these other narratives.
So Eve's relationship with her mother was like very central to this plot. And then like just relationships in general between children and their like parents or caretakers was a really like common theme throughout the story. When did you figure out that that was something you wanted to explore with this story in particular, and like why did that feel like why was that important?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons. I knew, like I said, a lot of these stories have these villainous characters, and a lot of times it is the mother figure, or the stepmother figure, to be more specific. Usually the mother is deceased and she's kind of this angelic kind of, voice of reason that you keep in the back of your mind. And then there's the stepmother, who is, evil personified. And dad might be there, not his, it's kind of like this dynamic is what we see a lot in these older stories. And then I think also in YA, we have, it's a lot easier if the parents are not involved to craft a story about someone kind of, going off and saving the world or doing whatever. And that's a good storytelling device. It works a lot of times. But I'm curious about how it works when parents and caregivers are present. I'm curious about what that looks like for us, when we're talking about motherhood, when we're talking about Black motherhood, when we're talking about generational kind of issues between parents and children. It's, there's so many, it's such a nuanced issue. So there's that. And there's also my own kind of personal experiences. Like, I myself do not have a good relationship with my mother, but I've had wonderful relationships with my mother figures, people I have kind of collected along the way who have done that mothering for me. And then I have my own children now. I'm constantly thinking about those interpersonal relationships, and how they fit into fantasy, and how that can be reflected. I really like to see supportive caregivers, especially when we're writing about queer characters, because I think a lot of us, who
Mhm.
are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, sometimes we don't have that. And so I think it's nice to see queer Black characters having supportive caregivers. Not perfect caregivers, but supportive. And so I think I'm thinking about all of those things when I'm crafting these relationships. But that again is a theme that comes up over and over again, just because it's pretty personal to me and it feels important to the readers.
Mhm. Yeah, I felt like the nuance that was through it was really cool, especially as Eve is trying to figure like, is learning all of this new stuff and, like, dealing with those emotions, but also it's, like, never, like, the support, like you're saying, like, it never that part never goes away, even when all this
Yeah.
other, like, wild stuff is happening. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely was thinking a lot about, choices that we make as parents or caregivers, for the young people in our lives and how sometimes from their perspective, it looks like you are the big bad guy and you're doing these things, to spite them or to just to
Mhm.
make them just to give them a hard time. And really there's a whole other reason. But there's, just because I know the reason doesn't mean that it's not traumatic or hurtful to my child. And so I think acknowledging that and putting that on the page and having those characters really work through that is important.
Here on Wizard Team, it's no surprise that we love books. We also love supporting the independent bookstores.
With our bookshop affiliate link, you can not only get all the books on your TBR, but you can support indie bookstores and B&C at the same time.
And if you're not sure what you want, that ain't no problem. Check out our The Plot Thickens list full of recommendations from none other than Porshèa herself.
Head to www.bookshop.org/shop/Black Nerds Create to treat your shelves.
Treat your shelves!
Oh, that's nice. That's
Oh
clever.
my goodness!
That's clever.
Wizard Team is brought to you by Black Nerds Create, a collective providing content through the lens of critical and creative fandom. If you want to support or partner with B&C on projects like Wizard Team, let's build. Find out how at blacknerdscreate.com/support.
Appreciate that you spend so much time thinking about how much you have like the reader in mind when you're thinking about that, and specifically like the YA audience. And even though like we are adult readers, but we picking up YA. There's a specific tone you're trying to hit when you're talking to like the audience and you know who they are. And so that being part of your relationship building and the thoughts you have behind that is really interesting and very valid to have as a component of the work as you're doing it. And so speaking of another poignant relationship that you have in the story, there's the one between Eve and Nova. And it's I this is very me, but like I appreciate in your stories where like there's romance. Like I'm not a good like I can read romance when it's romance. I'm not really a romance plus other genre thing unless it's like just kind of like woven in really well or it serves its purpose and we're just there with it. And I feel like you always strike that balance well when I'm reading your books. And so even Nova sent out to me for that. She's not like she's like they're not like spending their time too much on their relationship. They're building is more about the what's going on around them, and then they build an established relationship based on everything around them. And because of that, she initially starts out a lot of her time with him being very hostile. So it's really refreshing that what leads and what seems to lead to her change with him revolves around him like actually seeking her consent in like relation to her and like building that as part of their relationship. So how important was it for you to include the idea of consent as a way to build attraction for a specifically YA audience?
Yeah, it is central, and I think it's a theme that runs throughout the story through the romantic aspect of it, but also, I think I think it's something that I touched on when I talk about the Kingfisher family and how their family came into being and how kind of what they wished for versus what they actually got, and how that affected specifically Claude's wife and Leah, and how you know consent is an issue that I think everyone should be educated about from as early as possible. And so I know that these books are going to young readers, but specifically with the romance between Eve and Nova, it's a central theme there because I want young people to understand that it's important and that it's not a mood killer to seek someone's permission for something, and that you have to have that permission first, and that no means no, and that that is a full sentence, and that there's so many kind of angles on it. But I think specifically with the romance, like you said, I love romance. I don't know that it's I have a really hard time when people kind of put my books into that romantasy category, because I
Mhm.
don't know that I don't know that I'm checking all those boxes. Or I don't even have 100% like clear view of what that actually means, but I'm like, okay, you know, okay. But for me, the romance is really about discovery. It's really about sometimes when you're a teenager and you have these big feelings and but you have a lot of responsibility, especially with young characters who have kind of been adultified because of their life experiences. Um, where is that line, and do you ever get a chance to kind of to say yes to something or to say no? What do those choices look like? I also wanted to I also really wanted to make sure that Nova was not kind of pushing into Eve's personal space in a way that felt, I mean, I feel like he's annoying in a certain way. Like he really is
Mhm.
kind of there, and she's like, why are you here? Like what is the deal? But I didn't want it to feel predatory, like, if that makes sense. Like sometimes I will read a
Mhm.
YA where the romance, and I'm just like, oh no. I'm like, this is stalking. This is something that's beyond, let's keep it in this fantasy realm. Let's keep it in this romance realm. But I think so. I think consent is key. I think having those characters acknowledge that is is very important to the story, and again for my readers, because I love a good YA. I am 40 and love a good YA, but I know that my readers, my target audience, those are young people, those are teenagers, those are, even preteens pick up some of these books sometimes. And I'm really aware of the kinds of things that I'm saying to them through these characters.
So, just getting into the villain, we've only briefly touched on the knight, but he's, like, extremely powerful, and, like, a lot of his power comes from the kind of, like, murkiness and kind of, like, the way that his history is obscured. And so I was curious, like, what your favorite part of writing the knight was, and just, like, weaving in the, like, kinda hints about his backstory through, yeah, like, through the story.
Yeah, I think my favorite part of writing him, because he is, without like too much of a spoiler, like we find out eventually why he behaves the way that he does, and it seems like a very kind of superficial reason, but he's bitter, and he doesn't like to feel like he has been bested in any way, shape, or form. And I think we all know somebody like that. Like I feel like we all know somebody who just can't lose gracefully ever.
Mhm.
And so for me, crafting his kind of wish granting ability, where I was trying to think of like, okay, what might someone wish for, and then how can I take exactly what they said and turn it into something terrible. Not because they really even said anything wrong, just because the way that they phrased something gave kind of a loophole for the knight to grant this wish. That was interesting for me and engaging for me to write, just as a creator. But it really, like, it feels bad. It feels bad to listen to a character say, "I wish for A, B, and C," and then think about how can I just jack this whole situation up? Like, how can I just make this so terrible based on that one thing that they said? And again, the night is not based on a specific person, but I feel like I've known people in my life who will take something that I have said and
Mhm.
twist it around and make
Mhm.
it into something that it's not. And then I have to deal with the consequences of that. And so that is who he is, in his at his core. That is the type of person, being that he is. And so it's fun to write those characters, but it also puts me in a place where I'm just like, man, I've known some characters in my life. And this is kind of he's kind of a representation of those types of people.
Mhm. Yeah, there was a moment specifically, which I'm not gonna spoil, but, like, he just his response, I was just like, "You're just not like you just
Like,
can't let
why?
anybody have anything. Like, why can't you just chill for once? Just let
Right,
it go."
right.
Yeah,
Like, why you act
just
like that? Like, why? You know? Yeah.
I think that also speaks to like our need, our often we having a need to like seek reason. And sometimes
Mhm.
you're just not going to be happy with someone else's reason. Like they're just not going to have a reason that's going to satisfy like okay, that makes sense. Like they're not going to make any sense. They're
Yeah.
that's just what they're on.
Yeah, that is something that I bump up against some a little bit of pushback with. It's kind of like, well, why is the bad guy so bad? Why is he like, are you really sitting here asking me why this man is so evil? Like I
Right.
really think that sometimes sometimes um there are people who just kind of enjoy that. They relish in that kind of
Mhm.
in causing that reaction in other people. And that's a really hard thing to confront because there is no rhyme or reason behind it. It's kind of like that doesn't make sense. But for him, it is about the cruelty of it. That is the point. And so he leans into that, and he's just a terrible person. Yeah.
This is an aside, but and not a spoiler, but it was not expecting for there to be kind of like someone that is kind of reminiscent of Howl's Moving Castle, but like the dark form. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think I appreciated that aspect of it as well. Like I did not know I was gonna get like Howl's Moving Castle vibes,
Yes.
but it does not at all feel like it because
Yes.
it's such a dark energy that you're like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I can't really yeah.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you said that because I haven't had anybody reference it to me yet. And I'm like, he lives in a moving castle and no one
Yeah.
has brought it up to I'm sure after pub day, more people will kind of discover that, but it is it was I'm such a fan, right? And of the book and the movie, but I always was like, even though we know Hal is he is who he is. Like
Yes.
he's annoying. He gets on my nerves so bad sometimes. But but I always think because of the way my brain works, I'm just kind of like, oh man, what if every intention was bad? What if everything was the opposite of that? Like what would that look like? And how would that kind of manifest itself? And how horrifying would that be to know that he's out there in this abode and like how does that what does that look like? And so that was definitely a huge inspiration for me, but like in an opposite way.
Mhm.
Yeah, like the horror of like you can feel the ground trembling and like things get crushed, people might get crushed. Like the
Right.
horror going like it really goes like Howl's Moving Castle does like uh,
The
light
fun.
sometimes. This does not have any brightness. It's
Yeah.
just it's just dark. So to like back up, but also like go deeper a little bit. The title "Sleep Like Death" doesn't have a really clear orientation until the penultimate chapter of the book. So as you're reading the story, at least as I was reading the story, you can help but to wonder like at its meaning, like how does it actually apply to the story? Did you have a vision for like there being multiple different ways the title could apply to like multiple aspects of the story? Or were you thinking about a specific thing about Queensbridge, like the kingdom itself, having that like because the people kind of are sleeping, quote unquote, you know?
Yeah.
How did you really think about that? Or and I know sometimes titles don't come until like way later into the process, but it kind of felt intentional.
Yeah, so I would say in the very, very beginning, maybe that very first draft, I was calling it Dead Girls in Glass Coffins. That was kind of the title that I had in the
Mm.
very beginning, that first draft. But I didn't want to give too much away. I didn't want to, I mean, we know that this is a Snow White reimagining, so I also felt like it was a little kind of too on the nose. And so when I was drafting, that was kind of the placeholder title. And I got to the ending chapters and I wrote those words and I was like, I think this is a much better fit. This fits much more with Cinderella is Dead. Also,
Mhm.
a three-word title. We're talking about death. We're talking about, Cinderella's dead, sleep like death. It felt like it kind of meshed better together. I wanted people to know that these two books were related. And so everything kind of fell into place once I wrote that very last chapter. So and then I think kind of going back through revisions, I made sure that the story kind of leaned into the title even more in places where I could enhance that with the people of Queensbridge and the Queen herself, even Eve and Claude and his boys and all of these people that were kind of living in this space. I think everyone kind of has an awakening as we come to the end of this story. So it felt like it felt like a better fit.
Yeah, I liked all of that. It felt when I was reading the story again, I was looking out for it, and then I'm like, these people are kind of asleep. Like they're kind of like, especially when it came to like the relationship between the royalty talking about like, hey, we don't seek out the knight, don't go make wishes with him, and then they're like, but like I can trick him, mom. I can fix him, and you're like,
Right.
no, you
You can't.
can't.
You can't.
And so if that was also things like, oh crap, like they're sleeping their way into deathly stakes because they really think that they can get past this man, and it's like, no, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Another element that I really enjoy your writing. I'm sorry, I'm having like a fan fest here, but it's the fact that you really reserve like key plot points for the first two acts of the story. So like oftentimes like we're getting into the third act of the story, and you're like, crap, like there's no big wrap up right now. We're still moving. There's still things happening. Um, but you're also able to wrap up the stories without like there being too many loose ends at the end, even though you have all this action and like new elements being added to the story as it goes on. How do you strike that balance between keeping stakes high around throughout the story, and even especially throughout the end, without leaving readers feeling unfulfilled the whole way through as you get to that point?
Yeah, I think my drafting process, as I'm going through that process, I am thinking about my main story, my main kind of plot line, but also there's a B plot, there's a C plot. I'm thinking about these subplots, and I like for them to be wrapped up at different points in the story because it feels kind of like a mini ending or maybe like a
Mhm.
reward kind of in as we're moving along. So even though we have this bigger kind of overarching story that needs to be wrapped up at the end, along the way we're going to get answers to things that feel rewarding. And I think for me, I like to read books that do that because I sometimes lose interest. Sometimes I have ADD, so sometimes my brain is like, if you're not giving me something, I got to just set it down and come back to it later. So I try really hard to keep feeding the reader as we're going through. So it's an intentional thing, but it was something that I've kind of had to develop over several books to get that to strike that balance because I I like a three act structure, but I think as I've kind of moved along that it turns into more of a five act kind of structure with two additional kind of turns in the story. So my process has evolved over each novel, and I'm glad that it seems to be working because sometimes when you're writing it, it just feels like it's all over the place, and I'm never gonna get all these things to come together. But that works for me. Everybody's process is so different, but that's what works for me.
That's cool that you're looking to like hit the reward center of the brain. Like if you reward center, that's I'm gonna
Yeah.
like think about that when I'm
Yeah.
reading. Like, do I like this
Here's
because
a
I just
treat.
got a reward? Like, is
Yeah.
Well, thank you. This is such a great conversation. Well, if you can say, what can we expect from you next?
Yeah, so Sleep Like Death is out June 25th. And then I have my middle grade series. My middle grade vampire series is wrapping up in October 8th. The third Vanquishers book comes out. I'm very excited about that. And then next year, I have another young adult horror novel that is coming out. I don't have a title for that yet, but we are working on that right now. So lots of fun things I'm very excited about.
fantastic.
Yay.
Please know that we will be picking all those up. I have again the horror and the vampires. I've been loving the Vanquishers, and I've been trying to share them with like my like younger cousins and stuff, and like
Mhm.
peer at them like, okay, how do you feel about it? Where are we going? This is good. So like
Yeah,
I'm
my
really excited to see what happens.
My sister, she's 11. She loves the Vanquishers. I showed her the new cover or whatever. She was just like, "Ooh." I'm excited for her to
Oh, I love to hear that.
she's almost old enough to read Cinderella is Dead, and um I'm excited for her to do that because when I first got the book, she was so drawn to the cover, and she was just like, "But why is Cinderella dead?" She was just so concerned about it. And I'm like, "Well, now you're almost old enough to actually read it." So that'll be really fun to talk about with her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That'll be good. That'll be good. Yep.
Yeah, so thank you, Kalynn, for joining us. Please let people know where they can find you and your work.
So I am on most social media with the same handle, at Kalynn Bayron. I also put updates and news and stuff on my website, which is just kalynnbayron.com.
Awesome. Thanks, y'all, for listening. Join us Wednesday, where we will be starting our newest season, discussing Bloodmarked by Tracy Deonn.
Wizard Team is a part of Black Nerds Create Collective. If you want to keep up with our content, you can check out our website at blacknerdscreate.com and follow us on Instagram and Tumblr at Wizard Team Pod and at Black Nerds Create.